Hello and welcome to the Chap looking something like a giant green mushroom. Now I'm just marching up and down this corridor trying out this get-up. This is a very early French Golf War 1 F1 uniform for those that are interested. But probably what is interesting you even more is what I have in my hand, which we've been teasing you with since the new year. This is a FAMAS F1, a genuine military version. So if you don't know anything about the FAMAS as such, I suggest you go straight to Ian McCullum's episode on that. There will be a link at the end of this episode about the general history. Now the one that he shows is a 223 semi-auto version, whereas this is a full auto version. So what I want to do in this episode is to look at all the extra gubbins that this has that don't appear in Ian's vid. So I will say this now, this video does not contain any shooting, so please don't moan about it down in the comments. You have been warned. Right, so let me get out of this cosplay stuff and let's get down to business.
Oh, that's better. And back once again in my beloved workshop. So, step one is going to be to give this a feel strip, and then we'll basically talk you through from this bit down to there, which is the mysterious black box. Now, along the way, I'm going to be using some official documentation. I have here a repair guide, which describes basically the different echelons of repair that need to be done in the field and then further back as necessary. And also this document, which seems to be some kind of technical guide, sort of introductory guide to the system in general. And both of these were very kindly provided by Matt from the M426 gun shop. Thanks, Matt, for that. Right, let's get to it. So here we are with a naked FAMAS. Let's just pick up the main bit. We'll come to the black box later. So, trigger mechanism. How does it work? Well, quite easily. Because it's a bullpup, you need to transfer the movement from the trigger all the way back to here. And this is done with a transfer bar, which is here. You can just see it. It's a bit floppy in there, but it's well attached, I assure you. And where it matters, namely from here on, it's fully supported in the frame. And what happens when you pull the trigger is that it's going to move the transfer bar backwards and forwards. And these little shiny points are rivets, which are riveting two studs here, which each have a role to play in the trigger mechanism, as we will see. The transfer bar also has two return springs. There's one here and one for the trigger reset. And because it's quite important in this rifle that it comes back reasonably forcefully, as you will see. So, how does the front selector switch work? Because we have two. We have one on here as well. Well, here we have, in this position, we have safe, and it just has a little bit of play. And then we have semi-auto, which the trigger moves only so far. And then we have full auto, where the trigger has full travel. And how does that work? Well, it's quite simple. What we have inside connected to this flag is a drum, which looks a little bit like a camembert, to be honest. We have a look at the drawing here. And there we go. So it's a sort of pie-shaped disc with three surfaces on it. We have a flat on either side of a central wedge, and these flats have different heights. So when the flag is set to the safe position, we have then the full height of the wedge underneath the nose of the trigger, which means that it can't go anywhere. I'm trying to see if you can see that there, I think. There. If I flip it to semi-auto, you have one of the flats is there presented under the nose of the trigger, and the trigger then rotates until it hits that flat. And if we move it then the other way, we have the then deeper flat in front of the nose of the trigger, and then the trigger can fully drop. And you can see the effect here at the back. I tried drawing on it, it didn't work. So that's the full travel. And see the gap here at the back. Full travel, and that is semi-auto travel. So the next step is to find out what's happening in this mysterious black box. Now I've subdivided it into two. Basically from the hammer forward is the sear assembly, and then you have the burst fire assembly. Now I had, when I was planning this vid, I had some people saying, oh, why don't you just take it apart? Well, no, because it looks more or less like this inside, and trust me, there are 11 springs to take care of in here, in a very confined space, so rather you than me. Anyway, when I started looking at the sear mechanism, I thought, well, that looks fairly simple. The sear just has to rotate out of engagement with the hammer. Hammer flies forward, job done. But when I started looking deeper as to what the sear actually has to do to function correctly, I think that the design team may have had this kind of discussion. Entrez. Okay. Bonjour, patron. Me and the lads, we have a question concerning the trigger sear you asked us to design. Should we be having a pivoting sear or a linear one? Yes. Yes, okay, but how many degrees of freedom? I want all of them. So what parts do we have that we need to consider? Well, the sear assembly, in terms of the actual driven assembly, we have here the driven sear, and we have the driven sear actuator. This top bar here interfaces with one of the lugs on the transfer bar. And this part here we're going to ignore for now. That's the out of battery safety. I recommend looking at Ian's vid where he does a good explanation of that. So we'll leave this one out of it because that plays no role in the driven sear assembly. And of course we have the hammer, which has a tumbler of sorts with its sear notch. Spring and spring guide rod. Now spring guide rod is not there just to stabilize the spring. It also has an active role in the burst fire mechanism, which will come later. Now each of these parts you can see here is biased with a spring, which has a spring follower here. So all three parts here have one. So they're all biased to pivot towards the rear of the mechanism. So into engagement with the hammer. So to explain exactly what's going on in the sear assembly, I've built this bigature. And we have all the parts we need. We have the hammer with its tumbler assembly and sear notch, the driven sear in red, and its actuator in yellow. Now, in full auto, it's very, very simple. All that happens, if you remember what happens on the safety flag, in full auto, the trigger is allowed to rotate fully, which means you get the greatest travel on the actuator, and all that does is it pulls the sear way out of engagement with the hammer, and then that is then free to rotate until you run out of ammo or you drop the trigger. So far so good, but then I ran into a problem of how does it work in semi-auto, because you need some kind of disconnector after every shot, and there's no extra parts in this that could act as a disconnector. For those that don't know, a disconnector will be a part that allows the sear to trip after you've pulled the trigger, so that it re-engages the hammer after every shot in a semi-automatic firearm. So then I studied the mechanism a bit further, and actually building this made me realize what was actually happening. The secret lies in the shape of this tooth here, which is underneath the nose of the sear. This cutout is just an enormous stress relief cut. Engineers will know why that's there. And then we have this large cutout here, which also plays a part. And lastly, which you can see here, you can see that the shape of the hole for the sear pin is actually oblong on the sear. For the driver actuator and the automatic out of battery sear, it's just a hole, but this one is elongated, and that plays a special role. So you can see that if I just cock the action. So far so good, that's what's supposed to happen. The sear engages, but then if I let go and let the hammer spring pressure drop, you see what just happened there. The sear's dropped down on it slid on the axis here, and you can see that the actuator is now level with the little tooth. So what happens when you pull the trigger is that the actuator is going to push on this tooth. Now we're going to go back to what happens with the trigger. Remember that the travel of the trigger is restricted in semi-auto, which means that the actuator is also going to be limited in travel. So look what happens when we pull the trigger. So this is how far the actuator is allowed to go. So it has pulled the sear out of engagement with the notch, hammer is dropped, but then if you see the oblong opening here, the sear has popped up and over the actuator stud here, and that's gone inside the cutout, and that means that actually the sear is still in engagement with the tumbler portion of the hammer, so that when it gets recocked by the breech block, it moves enough to be re-engaged. And now what happens? Well, then say this would be the case where the shooter has kept his trigger pressed after the shot, and then it releases this shot, releases the trigger. Now I'm going to have to aid this because my springs are not well balanced. But what will happen is that the sear will sink back down again, and the actuator is free to re-engage the tooth. Then once again, shot fired, recocked, hammer out, reset, and we're good to go again. So that's how you have a disconnector without having any additional parts. Although, having said that, there's a lot of parts between the trigger and the sear. So you can see this tripping action in real time. Here I've put everything that we need back. The hammer has fallen, dropped, trigger is still pressed, so the shot's gone off. We have a recoil, recocks the hammer, and so now I'm going to release the trigger, and look what happens with the hammer. There's a little jump. Now what's just happened is that the actuator has slipped out from underneath the sear, from that little notch in there. This allows the sear under the force of the hammer return spring to drop because of its oblong slot. So that causes the slight jump in the hammer, but there's no chance of it disconnecting with the notch. And that means that the actuator is back engaging the front of the tooth, ready for the next shot when I pull the trigger. Right, finally, what's happening back here? Well, let me show you back with some drawings. Oh, hang on a minute. Not that drawing, because there's nothing there. This is normal, by the way. This is a military repair guide, but it is dated June 1979, and the pattern for the FAMAS with burst mechanism was only approved in July 1979, so hadn't made it to the manuals yet. It actually looks like this. But that is also very, very complicated to explain what's going on. So here we are with the second bigature of this episode, and that's basically a 2D representation of this. So let's quickly go through the component parts and briefly the relation between them. So in the green here is the hammer. Notice there is a second sear notch here at the back, and we have the spring guide rod. This big scoop-shaped white thing here is the limiter sear. So this, after 3 shots, is going to flip up and engage the sear notch at the back here. This big black thing is just a mounting block, various things hanging off it. That bit here, it's about the only thing here that's not under any spring tension and not moving. Now what looks like a big red hand is the reset trip lever. So if you happen to release the trigger after just 1 shot of the burst or 2 shots of the burst, this thing will ensure that next time you pull the trigger, you have the full 3 available. Then we've got a relatively complex ratchet wheel here, which has 3 main components. On this side, we have 3 notches which are being driven by this catch. And the catch is hinged on this orange lever. And the lever is being worked by the spring guide rod of the hammer. On the other side, we have another element of the ratchet wheel, which is 1 tooth out of phase with the other side, and that's just interfacing with this blue pawl, so that after every drive of the catch on the other side, the ratchet wheel assembly is held in place by the pawl. And then there is also this cam surface in dark blue, which is also part of the ratchet wheel, and that is keeping the limiter sear in position. It's biased downwards against it, so that at one point it's going to trip down once the 3 shots have gone. Underneath we have this big L-shaped thing. Now that is basically the clutch, if you like, to engage or disengage this whole mechanism, so that if you want full auto unrestricted, you want to disengage the system, and if you want 3 round burst, you have to re-engage it. Now this is going to slide up and down, and that is actuated by a cam, obviously round in the drawing, so that when you flip this switch, this will move, slide backwards and forwards, and work on this lever to basically put it out of the way once we want to do full auto. And it also has another function here. When you put it to full auto, if you flip the switch, it anchors the limiter sear in the downward position so that it won't work, which is this bit. 3 round burst, full auto. Okay, here goes. Firstly, I'll remove the selector switch and the decocking lever because we don't really need them, they'll just get in the way. So here we have a situation with the hammer decocked. Now when you cock the action manually, what happens is the guide rod goes back, pushes the lever here in orange, which makes the ratchet wheel drive forward. Now what happens when you cock it manually is that it doesn't travel far enough so the pawl engages its first catch on its ratchet wheel. So when the first shot fires, that doesn't count on the ratchet. So we have shot number 1. This hammer goes forward. The lever assembly and the ratchet basically reset to their initial position, like so. So shot number 1, hammer is pushed back, pushes the lever. This drives the ratchet wheel. Now because of the force of recoil, we get over travel of the hammer, which pushes the lever completely and allows the pawl to catch the first of its own teeth. System flies forward, shot number 2. Whole system goes back, apart from the ratchet wheel, which is held in place by the pawl. Shot number 2. System flies back again. Ratchet is driven again. Once again, over travel of the hammer. Pawl engages tooth number 2. System resets, shot number 3 now. Last tooth engaged on this side. Everything lines up. hammer flies back last time. Everything's driven. And at this moment, the pawl engages the last tooth, and what has happened on the other side is that this blue cam has rotated to such an extent that the limiter sear can drop down, which means the nose pops up and engages the second sear notch here, and the hammer is then held back. Now the reset is very, very simple. You see this tongue-shaped thing here. That is actually in between the front and rear ratchet wheel, and all that does, you have to imagine this is going between the two ratchet wheels. You've got to imagine how many times I've run through this. Something like this. And if you remember, at the beginning of the trigger explanation, I said that there was a second lug here on the transfer bar, and that, when you release the trigger, pushes on this side of the tab, and that pushes both the catch and the pawl out of engagement with the ratchet wheel. So as I just mentioned, these pawl and catch are pushed out of the way, and the torsion spring on this ratchet assembly is extremely powerful, and what that does, it means it whizzes then clockwise back to its original position, and this is what happens. It rotates. That means the blue cam also rotates with it back to an initial position. That pushes the tail of the limiter sear upwards, causes the nose to go downwards, and disengages from the second sear notch in the hammer. The hammer is then free. It's then immediately caught by the normal sear assembly, ready for the next cycle. And how does the clutch work? Well, that's very simple. You imagine that this is rotating on the pivoting around its own axis, which would put it like this. It pushes the whole lever assembly back. You can see this happening there. See the movement there? Which means that when the hammer cycles backwards and forwards, it's going to do this movement, and never enough so the pawl catches the first of its teeth, and it means that the counting mechanism for the sear here is not active, and as I'd mentioned earlier, this sear is also caught by this hook at the top. So before we wrap up, I just thought I'd mention this document, which is, as I said at the beginning, appears to be some kind of reference guide, introduction guide to the concept rifle. So I'm guessing it's probably sort of dated around 1977. And in here, there is in fact a burst fire mechanism, but it is slightly different. And it might hold the key as to why they were having trouble developing it. It's pretty much the same. The only difference is the hammer stop after 3 rounds. Instead of having this big sturdy scoop thing that comes up and engages directly with the hammer, what we have is this bar which is controlled the same way, so it gets held out of engagement by the cam, which is there, and once the cam rotates enough, it drops down, and it drops down into a notch cut into the spring guide rod. Now, considering that this is reciprocating at warp factor snot, it's really not a good idea to cut a big notch in it. So I'm guessing that that was probably one of the reasons why they had to go back to the drawing table for the burst fire mechanism. Another interesting point is, if you look at the document regarding the bayonet. You can see there's actually a HKG3 or HK33 bayonet, which was of course extensively tested during the development phase of the FAMAS. You can see somewhere there is a funny thing on the front, which I can't find now, of course. There we go. You can see it's got a socket for the bayonet mount on the front sight post assembly. Anyway, I thought that was interesting. So here we are this time, genuinely at the end of the episode. I know it's been extremely long. Nevertheless, I thought it was important to show you exactly how all the system works. Probably one of the last Franco-French firearms designed from the ground up with all its eccentricities in there. And sadly, so ultimately, probably for the best, it's being replaced by the HK416. So I thought it was about time everything was shown. So that just leaves me one more thing to say, and that's, oh, hang on, is that for me? Oh, awesome. I always wanted one of these. There we go, my life is complete. Anyway, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time back here in the workshop or on the range. Bye.